Hello and welcome! Now, how did video games become more than just a silly toy which plugs in to your television? Well, in the early days, the easy solution was to go and modify an existing idea. And this concept can easily be seen with the company behind the Atari 7800, a company which started out in life modifying arcade games. And today I'm going to tell you a tale on how they ended up actually making mods to making consoles. And while I'm doing that, I will also be doing some modifying on my own to get this Atari 7800 outputting composite video and audio. Check out our games from 16-Bit Games. They are available for free on Android and on iOS. So check out our storefronts from the cards or the links in the description. Now, the Atari 7800 wasn't actually made by Atari. That would be too easy. Instead, it was made by a company called General Computer Corporation, or GCC. Now, GCC was founded in 1981 when 3 MIT students couldn't find a speed-up kit for Atari's Missile Command. A speed-up kit was a small modification board added to an arcade game that allowed it to make the game, a little more interesting. It would, make the game run faster, or sometimes they even added in new levels, characters, and all that type of stuff. It's like DLC. Imagine if Donkey Kong could be modified with a small board to make Donkey Kong Jr. Just slap it on there. That's effectively what a speed up on pretty much any modification board was. Small bit of chip soldered onto the side, almost like that, except a lot more elegant. This mod board GCC made for Missile Command not only made the game faster, but it made it harder, more interesting by switching the colors around in the game. After they finished the mod, they decided to sell it for $295. It apparently sold very well. But once Atari caught wind that somebody had modified their game without their consent, they did what came naturally to any video game console manufacturer. They sued them for $15 million. But GCC wasn't going to give up easily. Their new mod was starting to make money, and they fought back, dragging the court case well into 1982. This is when Atari's parent company, Time Warner, took notice. They saw the boys at GCC had skill with arcade hardware, and they worked out a settlement. The deal was that Atari would drop the suit, and GCC in return would make them 3 arcade games. And they would have to ask really nicely for permission before modifying any more games. So, if you don't mind signing here, and sniffing here. The deal resulted in some truly amazing Atari games like Quantum and Foodfight, but GCC wasn't finished modding games just yet. During this time, they made one last arcade mod, this time for a Midway published game called Pac-Man. They called this mod Crazy Auto, and GCC pitched it to Midway, who not only liked the mod, but was tired of waiting for Namco to make a new Pac-Man game. So they took GCC's Crazy Auto and turned it into a full-featured game. Now, you might have heard of this game. It was called Miss Pac-Man. This was the kick that GCC needed to get into video games full time. They continued working with Warner and Atari, making tons of Atari 2600 games, like a home version of Miss Pac-Man and Dig Dug. But it wasn't enough for GCC. You see, modifying is the easiest way to move the industry forward. It's not necessarily the best. one of the better ways to push the industry forward was to actually go and innovate. And GCC, well, the ambitious bunch wanted to go and innovate upon something very ambitious: the console market. GCC watched as Atari's new system, the 5200, failed in the marketplace, and decided that they could design a system which could easily surpass it. In order for them to be capable of surpassing it, they decided that their system needed to have games which looked like the arcade games. And to entice consumers to actually buy it, their system needed proper Atari 2600 compatibility. GCC called their idea the 3600 and pitched the idea to Time Warner as Atari's next system. But Atari had other plans. During this time, Atari was contacted by a Japanese company called Nintendo, asking if they can bring their family computer, the Famicom, to North America. Atari and Nintendo were working out a deal through 1983 and was due to sign in June. That was until CES of 1983, where the then president of Atari Incorporated, Ray Kaiser, saw a fully working version of Donkey Kong on Coleco's new Atom computer. Kaiser was furious at Nintendo since Atari had the rights to produce Donkey Kong for computers. But what Mr. Kaiser didn't realize was that Atari only had the computer version of Donkey Kong to be released specifically on floppy disk, whereas Coleco was well within their rights since they obtained the rights to publish and produce Donkey Kong on cassette. But Mr. Kaiser's outrage severely damaged the deal with Nintendo, and afterwards Atari quietly asked him to leave. The fallout from this was devastating. Time Warner and the new management at Atari were desperately looking for something new. At this time, in mid-1983, the video game market was in the beginning of a 2-year crash, and Atari was in financial trouble. But luckily for Atari, GCC had finished the prototype for the 3600. Its new graphics chip, Mariah, could easily reproduce the look of arcade games of the time, and with a special CPU called Sally and some 2600 components, it was pretty much 100% compatible with the 2600. Atari, desperately needing more money, quickly launched the 3600 and renamed it to the 7800. And less than a year later, in 1984, it was out in the market for $150. But sadly, this was short-lived. In a short amount of time after the system launched, Atari had no money and went bankrupt. Now, it didn't take long before there was a buyer. It was the founder and former president of Commodore International, Jack Tramiel. But from what I read, he didn't buy it to save Atari. He bought it to get back like good old Commodore. Because of this, the work GCC had done on the 7800 was never paid for, and Jack Tramiel, who was a notorious penny pincher, wanted Time Warner to pay for it, since he believed that it should have been a part of the initial buyout. Time Warner, on the other hand, wanted Tramiel to pay for it, since he was now the owner of Atari, and therefore owned the debt. But by 1985, Tramiel relented and paid for the work done on the 7800 himself. He then retooled Atari. Instead of focusing on computers, they were now focusing on game consoles once again, and by the spring of 1986, the Atari 7800 was relaunched into the market with a new competitive price of $80. The markets welcomed the Atari 7800 with open arms. The video game crash was started in 1983 was well over, and gaming systems were once selling again. But in the 2 years Atari wasn't in the market, a new competitor came in: Nintendo. By 1986, Nintendo had successfully entered the North American market and was doing what GCC had set out to do all those years ago, and now was leading the industry. In contrast, the Atari 7800 launched with games like Joust, developed on the Atari 7800 by GCC in 1984, released originally in the arcades in 1982, on a system which was finally available to the public in 1986. This sort of set the tone for the new Atari, and the system sold well enough, but not to the heights that Nintendo was now bringing in. And due to the mess Atari and Time Warner created, GCC sadly left the video game development scene. But it did find some success in modifying hardware in the computer market. Anyways, back to my 7800. I absolutely love it. It's such an innovative system for 1984, made by a group of absolutely amazing hardware engineers. And now with my simple little mod, I can play it the way I want to, and without any static or video issues. But anyways, thank you guys for watching, and take care.